Today's video is about the tower. And the tower is the card in the major arcana that represents the start of the actual awakening process. The moment of facing the abyss and the moment of epiphany, the realization, the true realization of the sorrow of the world that leads you into what sometimes is called the long dark night of the soul. So this is pretty serious sounding stuff, and indeed, if you look at the image on the card, the image is of a tower being struck by lightning and a figure falling off that tower, possibly one would assume to their doom. And there's fire falling from the heavens and great destruction. Now, traditionally, this tower has sometimes been connected to the idea of the Tower of Babel from the Bible. Now, in the Bible, the Tower of Babel is never actually struck by a thunderbolt. But it is comparable in at least one important sense, which is that what does happen at the Tower of Babel is that the people that were there in the story have come together to construct this great tower that will reach to heaven, and it will make them the equals of God or the gods, right? And the Lord looks at this and he strikes the people dumb with incomprehension, so that they can't understand what each other is saying. And that's how the many languages of the world came to be. At least that's the story. And the tower in the tarot is a card about being struck with incomprehension, about being literally blown away by the significance of a spiritual realization that shatters the constructs that you'd created for yourself. In most traditional looking decks, what you have in the image of the tower is the very top of the tower being blasted by this thunderbolt and falling, right? In this deck, which I like quite a bit, you can see the thunderbolt actually pierces through right to the very core of the tower, breaking it down. There's also the Thoth deck, Crowley's Thoth deck, which is another very interesting one, where like what is striking from the top is actually the all-seeing eye, and the flames that are coming out are coming out of the bottom and destroying the tower at its very foundation. And I kind of like how both of those cards use that imagery, because they represent this idea of breaking something so thoroughly that there's no way to build it back again. And that's the spiritual process that the Tower card signifies. It's the first point in the moment of actual awakening, of enlightenment, that is a process that can take moments or minutes or maybe hours to go through. The Buddha did it over the course of one night. But in the Tarot Major Arcana, there are no less than 4 cards that are dedicated, you could say, to that process. The Tower, and then the Star, the Moon, and the Sun. So this is a very important moment in the Major Arcana, considering that other cards represent processes that can take years to go through. Now, the moment of realization is when you get to this point of suddenly breaking through this construct that you've created for yourself. So the tower has all of this, represents all of this construction you've made in your being, right? The tower is the tower all of your assumptions, of all of your ideas, and of all of your ambitions, including, or maybe especially, your spiritual ambition. In some decks, older decks usually, it's called the House of God. And that's because it's not the house that God has. It's the house that you build to try to trap your idea of God inside that house. It's the tower that you put God into. You put this whole idea of everything you are and everything the universe is and everything that God is, and you say, that's it, right? And the image of the tower is this image of reality, of the actual universe, striking that construction and falling it to pieces. And it is really a moment of inability to come back to that illusion. When the tower gets hit by the thunderbolt, then you know that really the power that you thought was in that construction isn't there, and there's no coming back to the more ignorant state where you thought it was. So you could ask, well, okay, if I haven't gotten to that point, to that moment yet, then what is the use of this card for me? And the truth is that moment, that construction, and then that destruction, there's a representation of it that is the total, the one that is the actual moment of awakening. But in a way, that moment is rehearsed over and over again in a person's lifetime, or over many lifetimes, you could say. And really, that's what all the cards have, right? They all represent a particular step or stage in the journey of spiritual awakening. But each of those steps are steps that we could say we rehearse again and again in our lives in smaller ways. And I'm sure that most people can connect to those moments where you thought you had sorted something out, where you had this idea or this assumption, maybe one that you never even questioned in your life, and then suddenly something comes along and breaks it down completely. That's what the tower represents. It's that moment of this complete breaking down of everything. It's the moment it's a moment of grace, in fact, because it's something that you can't do by yourself. It frees you from this trap you've put in yourself. But it's a pretty shattering grace. This is the horrible part of grace, or of awakening. So you have all these limiting definitions that you've put into your personal tower, including your definition of the spiritual. And in this thunderbolt that hits it, you get the first view of what is the true, as opposed to this construction. You get your first view, you could say, of what is the real eye of God, and not the false God that you've tried to imprison in your little house there. So the house of God is something much more vast than anything you could have imagined before. And this shattering process is the first moment where you now go through this stage of intense struggle sometimes, and conflict, and then eventually a preparation and acceptance of the end of all that you understood. And then going through this dark kind of valley of death, you could say, and eventually coming out in this moment of actual grace and illumination that is the sun. So what I've just described there are those three following steps: the star and the moon and the sun. But before you can do any of that, you have to be willing to accept this shattering of your life, right? And this is the first moment of choosing whether or not you surrender yourself entirely to the will of the divine, or whether you resist, whether or not so much resist, because there's no resistance possible, but if you refuse. And if you refuse, what that means is you sit there in the rubble and in the ruins, and you wallow in this collapse that has happened around you, and you refuse. Sorry, there was a little break there. I was saying you refuse to move. And when you are in that state that you refuse to move forward, essentially you can't go back and you can't go forward, but you can stay in that condition of wallowing in the ruins of everything you had seen or everything you had believed, in a pig-headed kind of way for as long as you actually want to, because the next step in this process that is described by these 4 cards is a step that you have to initiate, which is this step of this final purification represented by the star. And until you do that, then nothing's going to change. So the message of the Tower, be it for someone in the context of the spiritual path or on a personal level, is don't be surprised if you're wallowing in rubble and nothing gets better or changes, or there's no transformation happening, right? You have to first accept what is past, accept that it is past, and then you have to summon up this will to submit to what has happened. A lot of times when people bemoan their state, what they're really saying is that they refuse to accept what has been presented to them by reality. It's a rejection of reality. So this complaining or this lamenting or this sorrow is actually a refusal to submit yourself, to surrendering. If you surrender, then you understand that there's no point in clinging anymore, and you can walk happily forward towards that purifying pool that is represented by the star. And that'll be the subject of the next video.